Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Hello and welcome. On behalf of HarperCollins and on behalf of Readings, I am delighted to be able to spend this particular evening with you. My name is Chris Gordon. I am the Programming Manager for Readings, and I'm delighted that for the next hour or so, I get to hear all about one of my heroes, and certainly someone who everyone at Readings admires, Nick Cave. Now, I get to introduce a couple of blokes that have known each other for years and years and years. They met in Newcastle on the music scene. They've known about each other before they became mates. It's going to be Jack Marx that's taking us through the talk tonight. He's a writer, a commentator, and an absolute music lover. He's known about Mark Mordue's work for years and years and years, and it's tonight to him that we're going to be saying, Jack Marx, ask the difficult questions, get the memories going. We want to feel like that we were there in those early days where all that grunge was happening, when our jeans were just a tad too tight. Come on, Jack, do this for us. Give us those memories again. Over to you, my friend.
Hello, everyone, and we all know why we're here, so I won't waste any time. Mark, I know you've been working on this book since at least 2010. That's a long time. Why so? We've all been, a lot of people have been waiting for this over that time. What, apart from the usual writer stuff that we don't need to go into and life getting in the road, what was tough about this one?
Well, initially, I want to write an A to Z full life biography of Nick, and that was the contract I signed to do. And within a couple of years, the vastness of the subject matter was really getting the better of me. People would also say to me, "Oh, Nick's, still alive. He does so much. It must be." They had this idea that I had to sort of keep up with him, but I always felt I didn't have to do that. The other issue I had with Nick, apart from how much he produces, and not just in music, but in literature and film and soundtracks, the works, is just the depth of his work. So wherever you go with Nick and you try and drill down, there are all kinds of literary and historical references and cross-references to his own work. So you just get caught up in this enormous web. And, I'd also kind of set a real task for myself in terms of how I tried to structure the book. And I was just over-ambitious beyond all imagining. Like, I wanted to write a biography that was going to change the shape and nature of any biography as so imagined previously and totally blow all minds. And I think I've kind of half done that, but not quite to the kind of James Joyce meets Nick Tosh's kind of level that I was fantasizing about,
And when your own expectations get to that level too, it becomes incredibly hard to go anywhere near a computer. It's just a fearful, it's like you're trying to slay an enormous dragon that gets bigger and bigger as you feed it.
That's true. I felt too like you sort of go round and round in a spiral on the same things, and the sort of stuff that only concerns writers about whether to use and or but at the start, just crazy stuff. And it could almost be the opposite of that, not just fear of going to the computer, but obsessed with stuff that, and you're not moving on, And I just started to sort of collapse under the pressure, really. And to be really honest about it, I think I kind of had a bit of a breakdown. Like the relationship I was in collapsed. I was in massive financial problems. So even though it's been 10 years, it's probably really more like 5 years with a lot of hell and difficulty after that. And I kind of had to piece myself together to get to a different place with it and get a new contract with HarperCollins, get really great editors who understood what I wanted to do and helped me to kind of reframe the vision I had in ways that I wanted to go, and kind of helped me on a more human level as well. So I was kind of just more match fit to have a second go and do it in a new way. And I've said this before, but in a funny way, I think it's sort of better than me. The book, you know, the material still had enough strength to kind of last the distance when I'd almost sort of lost hope.
You had Nick on board right from the start. Was there ever any discussion about you kind of doing an auto for him, or him being more heavily involved in the book than in the end he kind of was?
Yeah, well, Nick was really great. He was very totally trusting. I mean, initially, of course, everything was more tentative, but once we established a relationship, he let me talk to his family, his mother in particular, who died this last year, not long ago, sadly. You know, the band, friends, past and present. So he was incredibly generous and trusting. And all we had basically was a handshake deal. And I just said, I'll show you the work. I'm not promising to change a word. And he took it on that understanding, and of course, you know, he still controls copyright to his lyrics and the like. So there's always a way in which we could be sort of mutually sort of destructive to the process. But yeah, even when things went sort of belly up and pear-shaped, he was really great about it, you know. And it only changed after his son Arthur died, and he kind of felt that the project was no longer relevant to him. And he wanted me to stop, and I understand that, but I had to say to him, I can't do that. I've got contracts, I've got concerns of my own, and so there was a degree of tension about Nick needing or wanting to protect his family from anything I might write, and me needing to kind of get myself out of a lot of difficulties and wanting to complete a kind of vision I had in a way that was meaningful to me and that had kind of affected my whole life. So we diverged, and I feel like basically now things are kind of in a more neutral space. I haven't heard back from him about the book. I hope I will, but I don't particularly expect to. It was never written for Nick. You know, when I went to Melbourne, I sometimes had this feeling that people either expected me to be Nick's servant or his assassin, and they never seemed to understand that I didn't want to be either, and I wasn't either. You know, I had a different kind of commitment, and that was to the book.
So it's kind of in an unusual space of being an unauthorized biography.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really like about it is that you don't take his word as gospel. Like, there's a few parts in the book where he tells you a story and you go on find someone else who says that Nick's recollection is not correct, and it's all included there. And that kind of throws up to me that question of whether biographies can ever be honest. I've always preferred unauthorized biographies because I know the type of people that are involved in authorized one are generally cheerleaders.
Yeah.
Unauthorized, you get gossip, but gossip is in a way more reliable than people's rose-coloured, unreliable recollections, you know. So this, I find, a kind of a mix of those two, which is really good.
Yeah, well, you know,
and, you know, there are people with axes to grind too with Nick, aren't there?
Yeah, sure.
You know, a lot of them his old Melbourne friends.
Well, you know, I mean, Nick's a polarising artist and individual, and there are plenty of people around who just hate Nick Cave and have for decades, or who are sick of his kind of almost permanent presence on the cultural landscape. You know, I can understand that. The book's about...
I can understand it too, but it's not as if he's playing in Coles, you know. He's pretty easy to avoid if you want to avoid him.
Well, yeah, this is true too, but I don't know. I think Nick's a kind of north-south pole for a lot of people's lives and for Australian culture. But the book's about much more than Nick. It's about growing up as a country boy in rural Victoria. It's about the kind of Melbourne punk scene and the Tiger Lounge and the Crystal Ballroom. It's about all those influences that were coming down the pipe in the 70s and kind of affecting all of us, you know. I've thought about it a bit, and I don't know, maybe it sounds like pretentious, but, you know, like it's, to me, it's that the early stages, it could almost be a rock and roll Catcher in the Rye, and then later on it gets a bit more kind of drugged out and poisonous, but it's still pretty fresh to the landscape, you know, before the Boys Next Door take off to England and are just about to kind of turn into the birthday party and become something more sort of demonic.
I found that a really beautiful moment at the end when they're getting together at Perth Airport, about to go to London for the first time. And I think on that plane trip, they decided to change their name to the birthday party. But as they're waiting at Perth Airport, Bon Scott's coffin enters the country before they leave. I find that sort of a really interesting passing of the baton from the 70s to 80s Oz rock, you know.
Yeah, Mick Harvey told me that story, and I thought it was really interesting too. And I guess, I mean, it's a funny thing about history. Hey, these things happen that are, I mean, this is a great thing about nonfiction. Coincidences that would be unbelievable in a novel are there and present in real, in day-to-day life. And at times, you know, in Nick's life, there's stuff that happens that has an almost sort of eerie kind of sense to it, you know, that something's going on another level, you know. But I guess it depends how cosmic you are about that sort of stuff, you know.
What's an example of that you can think of?
Well, I feel it's something that's more present in Nick's songwriting, and it gets stronger as his songwriting goes along later in his career. I'm just dealing with his boyhood and those Boys Next Door days. But for me, particularly his boyhood in Wangaratta, that's the kind of dreaming zone that a lot of songs come from. And Nick says so himself, you know, songs like Sad Waters, Red Right Hand. I realised when I was in Wangaratta, you could almost use it as a map to walk around town and find your way. You know, the river in Wangaratta, all these things are really kind of vital. And it's, I don't know, it's weird. It's like he was, in his songs, it's like he was dreaming himself out into the world. And now in his music, at different times, it's like he's trying to dream himself back to Wangaratta, but obviously not the Wangaratta that he grew up in, this Wangaratta that's in his head, you know. And, you know, all of us when we get older, I think we realise more and more as we age how significant our childhood and our teenage years are to us. And, you know, there's a real kind of beauty and melancholy in that. Of course, we romanticise it too, but there's something about time actually in it that I think is really intriguing. And I think Nick's ability to sort of, or desire to transcend time in his music in his late career with records like Ghosteen in particular, and from Push the Sky on, really, there's been a real shift. And that connects to Warren Ellis's music and soundscapes as well. Whereas earlier with Mick Harvey in the Bad Seas days, it was more about mythical landscapes and making the present world into something larger and darker, and kind of playing out psychic stuff in that world. And the Boys Next Door period and that country time in Wangaratta, it's where all of it comes from. It's like it's the I don't know, like a mine shaft where all this stuff is, you know, all the wounds and all the influences that Nick has drawn on ever since, really.
I think the thing that really impressed me about the book is, you know, I've been a Nick Cave fan since Boys Next Door when I was a kid, but I thought I knew everything that, you know, I really needed to know about him. But I was surprised to find what a genuinely troubled kid and teenager he was. I mean, also at the same time, what a run-of-the-mill dickhead he was.
Yep.
I found that about the book, that it both demystifies him, but also authenticates the whole persona that he's had since the birthday party days. You know, and in fact, the whole band, they seem to have been touched by death when they were just in their teens, and you know, it took me till the age of 30 before death came anywhere close to me. I just wondered how that would affect a band as a unit to all be, you know, terrible things like Tracy Pugh's brother
in tragic circumstances,
Yeah,
when he was a young boy.
they're all untimely deaths, you know.
Yeah, and obviously Nick's father dying in a car accident when he was 21, just before they began recording. The Boys Next Door began recording Door Door. Mick Harvey's father and father's best friend committing suicide, and there's all kinds of stuff there. I mean, it's kind of normal stuff, you know, like death is a part of life, but they had a particularly sort of strong nearness to it in different ways as boys and young men, and I think that's a big part of that step between Boys Next Door and Birthday Party. And the book kind of goes to that point where they're about to flower into the birthday party, and you know, obviously they're going to hit England and have a lousy time, and that's going to be the pressure cooker that makes all the life experiences and influences really kind of come into shape, you know. So it kind of is showing you all the kind of sort of groundwork. But you know, I want to say, you know, it's funny too, the book, you know. There's
lots. I mean, I laughed out loud at the little tale of Nick sitting around with a lot of his arts mates discussing influential, obscure pianists. The only name I recognised out of the bunch was Eric Satie, and Tracy Pugh's sort of sitting there not getting into it. And suddenly at the end of it, he's had enough and pipes up and says, you know what, piano music, I really like the theme from The Sting.
Yeah.
Which when I got a mental reminder of the ragtime dagginess of that was totally the wrong thing to say, but obviously intentional, you know.
Completely, you know. I mean, they all, I feel like, I mean, it actually was an accident, but just through the stories that Nick tells in the book and the other voices of people that tell me their stories too, you really kind of hear this Australian, sort of dry Australian humour, and I realised how difficult that must have been for them when they got to England and they would say something that was meant sort of sarcastically or self-effacing, and it would be taken quite literally. And I feel like you can hear this humour, particularly, which is a very Australian kind of quality as well, when it comes to things that are serious, you know. So it's that weird thing where people kind of mean it, or they talk around something and it's funny, but it might also be sad or vicious, as the case may be, you know. And that's, I like that quality in it. And something you talked about before that I didn't kind of quite answer in relation to different versions of history and what Nick says versus someone else. I really kind of wanted the book to sort of be constantly alive. So the best stuff in the book to me, or moments I really liked, was where there might be 2 or 3 or 4 different versions of something and of events leading up to things. So you kind of get this picture, this volatile picture, and it's like, well, what did really happen? And there might be 2 opposing views, but that's okay, you know, like they can kind of coexist and push against one another. And maybe there's no resolution to that, you know, because it's just how people see things.
I just want to read an self-edited version of a quote in the book that for me is really pivotal.
Okay. It's
from Bronwyn Bonney, who I think was Roland Howard's friend more so than Nick's in the beginning. But she says this: Nick had the right formula, very charismatic, plus not mentally ill, plus had family support, plus work ethic, plus personal creative vision, plus sense of chosenness, plus right place, right time. And she finishes off by saying, people are partly angry at Nick because they envy him, but he works like a demon and deserves his success. Yeah, for me, that kind of sledgehammers all these arguments about whether Nick's original or whether he uses other people, or that was even a parlor game back when the birthday party were riding the wave. Like, remember people used to say, oh, he's stolen off this, whether it was Can or Beefheart or in fact Simon Bonnie. And that passage just kind of did it for me, as if, you know, the guy has made it on his own terms, and there's nothing we can do about it, even if you don't like it.
Well, you know, like, Nick's significance is separate to whether or not you like his music. So he's a culturally important figure, and you can dismiss him or not the same way you can not like Bob Dylan or not like whoever, you know, not like Bowie, not like Leonard Cohen. But it's almost remarkable, but Nick has really begun to put himself into that sort of artistic stratosphere. And Nick's worst is good, usually, you know, so it seems to me across Nick's career, he's either good or great. That's pretty impressive in itself. And so I think Nick's worth looking at, and I hope the biography that I've managed is worth looking at, whether or not you're interested in Nick, and even if you hate him, because it's about all these other things. It's about culture, it's about history, it's about the social scene, it's about all the people around Nick who are really interesting, intelligent, creative people. You know, figures like Mick Harvey, figures like Roland S. Howard, you know, people like Anita Lane, Genevieve McGuckin, Phil Calvert, and Bronwyn Bonnie, of course, who you cited. Her quotes are just incredible. Like, Bronwyn would say stuff to me and just blow my mind with how insightful and acute she was. And she's got reasons to be critical of Nick, but she can also see his talent. So she's particularly good at speaking about him. And that quote that you read out, it's almost chilling in how coldly but impressively formulaic it is.
Yeah, and she also mentions elsewhere in the quote that he has a genius for spotting genius in others and incorporating it until that genius becomes his own, which is a very gracious way of saying he uses the talent of people around him. But, you know, that's a talent in itself. You mentioned Anita Lane just there. I was curious to read. Everyone who spoke about Anita in the book seemed to trail off with some sort of melancholy about what's become of Anita. Where is Anita, do you know?
No, I believe she's in Melbourne. I tried to contact her quite a few times. I mean, it's very difficult when you're working on a biography and you want to speak to someone, but you don't want to harass them or force them to speak to you if they don't want to. At the same time, obviously, Anita Lane was very, very important to Nick's career.
Was his girlfriend for how long?
Beg your pardon?
She was his girlfriend for how long?
So I don't know. I think, you know, throughout the sort of Boys Next Door period, well into through Birthday Party, and then, you know, Nick Bad Seeds period up to in Berlin. And I mean, you know, they obviously had on and off periods of time. So, but certainly a good sort of decade or more. And some of the most important music that he did was, yeah, through her. She wrote Stranger Than Kindness with Blixa Bar Girl, which I think is one of Nick Kavanagh Bad Seeds' best songs, and Nick says that himself. All that early stuff, you know, she designed the set for the film clip, These Boots Are Made for Walking, which is a really great film clip, I think. She sort of helped Nick design his clothes, she helped him with his look. She helped him with lyrics and influences. So she's had a really interesting solo career of her own, but she chose not to respond to my attempts to contact her. So I was dependent on pretty thin material, really. There was stuff in the two previous biographies by Robert Brokenmouth and Ian Johnson. I think there were one or two interviews online. And then, of course, I really had to depend too on the way people spoke about Anita Lane. And I think that the heartache is just that she was such an incredibly talented person as well, which Bronwyn Bonnie also speaks about. And I guess there's a feeling that she
got left behind.
Well, could have done more, and somehow should have gotten more. But that formula you read out by Bronwyn Bonnie, not many people meet all those sort of savage criteria when they all are added up. And I think a lot of men as well as women suffered for that in that punk and post-punk scene, because they didn't have all those attributes in place to get what they deserved. Again, as Bronwyn said, like that Nick wasn't necessarily the most talented, but he had all those abilities and background and opportunities in place to sort of marshal himself forward. And I think too, Nick's really interesting as an artist because he is so absorbent. So he's just gotten better and better and better. So he's a kind of an accumulator in that sense. And it's that accumulation and that sense of moving forward that's a part of him that's made him the artist that he is and made him a really great artist, where people who saw him when he was a young man beginning with Boys Next Door might have disbelieved and found impossible to imagine that this is the same guy who would go on to make records like Ghosteen or Push the Sky Away or From Her to Eternity, whatever it might be. It's just like, it's leagues away from what you might have thought was possible.
I remember Nick Cave in about 1989 saying in an interview that he really fantasized about being in Bob Dylan's position, where he could look back over his catalogue of albums and see growth and decline and failure and success. And it's really interesting listening to Rough and Rowdy Ways. I can hear Nick Cave in there. I reckon Bob Dylan's heard it and said, "Oh, I can do that." Have you heard that?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think you're totally right. There's a definite Bad Seeds influence.
Yeah, what's the big 15-minute track on that? When I remember when I heard Anthracene from Skeleton Key, I remember thinking, I've never heard drumming like that. Now I've heard it twice on Anthracene and the JFK song. I'm having a mental block on its name.
Oh, no, Murder Most Foul.
Murder Most Foul, yeah.
I normally fail those quiz questions. I was dreading tonight because I thought, oh, God, someone's going to ask me some trivia point, and I can never remember one thing from another. I still remember when I went to interview Nick, and I think we were talking about God Is in the House or something, and he said to me, "Oh, what album was that on?" And I couldn't remember. I had a mental block. And then he admitted he couldn't remember either. And we're both looking in the lyrics book trying to, oh, yeah, that's right. That's like two old guys with sort of shot brains sort of figuring it out. But I was kind of relieved that I didn't have to pass that test because I failed. That's why I'm all right. If I've got Google and my notes all around me, I can put it all together. But, oh, man, coming up on the spot with those fast, obscure answers.
Yeah. The feeling from the book too that I've always thought, it sort of reminds me of how small the scenes were, like Melbourne in particular, which has always struck me as kind of like an enormous country town, and it sort of seems like if you were anyone at all, you were and you were of the age to be able to get to those shows, you were there. People, surprising people popping up like Gina Riley from Kath and Kim, sort of hanging out with the Boys Next Door. And so naturally, being that there were so many people in that little group who'll probably have read this book now, there's going to be some backlash, isn't there?
Yeah, there's already been some. I think there's a couple of problems, one that I should have recognised, but people naturally just go to page 248 or 327. And, while I'd love them to read the whole thing from beginning to end in context and appreciate the entire meaning and literary ambition and feel of it, they just find themselves in a paragraph and go, oh, my God, how could you sum me up in that way? I tried to, honour everybody as best I could. And I wanted to include a lot of outsiders and people who had much smaller parts in the narrative because I believe they were important. And I want to include people that were critical of this, of what was going on in different ways too. So less friendly or amenable voices. I think too what happens is that time is so important to people and was so deeply formative. There's definitely a feeling of possessing the time, and it's their time. And sometimes I think their story gets sort of sucked up into Nick's narrative, and that's not necessarily how they see their lives and their experience of the time. So that's where some of the resentment towards Nick comes. And maybe that's going to be present too in the way people respond to my biography too. But I was trying to give some level of what might have been approach equal time to people. I have to say though, like there is a side to Melbourne that's like entering a kind of schoolyard where you're kind of sort of having to deal with the cool set, and there's this sort of weird sort of stunted immaturity and kind of bullying that kind of is a sort of background psychological feature, and the sense of ownership sort of warps into a sort of you kind of, people hold on to their secrets and don't want to tell you things, but if you get things wrong, they get really angry. So there's really no pleasing people in that respect.
Well, there's that line over the general thing too that any journalist knows. I don't think people have evolved to see their own words in print. You know, the printing press has only been around a couple of 100 years. Yeah, people, yeah. It's kind of like when you hear your voice back on a tape recorder for the first time when you're a kid and you go, no, that's not me. I think people see their quotes, you know, they're quite happy to speak to you, but then when they see it in black and white, you know, I've had people ring up and accuse me of making things up, and when I play the tape back to them of them saying it, they then accuse me of digital manipulation or something. You know, it's you can show them photographs of them saying it and they still don't believe it, you know.
Yeah, it's hard because sooner or later you're selecting and editing, and I mean you can't publish a telephone book or an entire transcript of every single person you speak to. So at some point or other, you are manipulating because you're structuring, you're putting things into place, you're creating patterns, you're making kind of judgments and colorations with your descriptions. You know, your word choices are political. All these factors come into play. I mean, if you're a good writer, you're aware of all that, you know all that, and you're trying to do two things too. You're trying to tell a good, factual, reliable history as best you can do it, but you're also trying to be entertaining and tell a story that's going to keep people engaged. So you need drama. You have to go to the core of certain things. You have to move with a certain degree of pace. You have to surprise. You have to kind of plunge and rise, you know, like all these sort of things that are the technical things that a writer must do to keep people in the story and make it worth their while. And that's your obligations to the reader rather than your interview subject. So it's a real complicated balancing act. I mean, you know, all I can say is I really did my best. Like, I don't seek certainly to hurt people or to sensationalise, because that's not what interests me. But I also know I didn't shy away from being as truthful as I could be. And that can maybe be, as you say, in cold, hard print, something that's a bit confronting for people.
What comes out, there are a few characters in the book that come out very polarising. Keith Glass is one of them, the guy who started Missing Link Records, which was Birthday Party's Australian label, wasn't it? And
yeah.
He strikes me as someone who was a real believer from early on, but he's come out in the end being branded by the band themselves as a sort of a Machiavellian rip-off artist, and it seems to me unfortunate. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I felt that Keith Glass was not as bad as the band had made him out to be in the past, and that he most definitely was a true believer in their talent. And he was one of the few on the industry side, if you can call Keith Glass an industry guy. I mean, my idea of him. He seemed to be more of a hippie anarchist from when he started Archie and Jughead record store with David Pepperell to evolving into the Missing Link record store and being like the most important record store in town and this big sort of place for discovering music for an entire scene. And then he saw early on that the Boys Next Door and Nick in particular had something really special about them. He bought Roland, his guitar that kind of shaped his sound for the next few decades. There was a lot of love in Keith Glass. Like, undoubtedly, he perhaps made a few mistakes. Obviously, when they got to England, the band felt deserted by him. But I mean, it's a bit like you could look to the division that occurred between Nick Cave and Mick Harvey in an even more complex way. These things are like the breakups of marriages, and there is a lot of bad and there's a lot of good, and it's inseparable. And perhaps people aren't sort of as saintly or ghastly as the extreme kind of cheer squads might say. And the odd thing about it too in the end is if people are back in the same room together, the people who experienced it between one another can often be more civil than those people who want to kind of get into a kind of to barrack for one side or another, like it's a car accident or a football match.
Hey, Q from KQ, you've got a question. I'm seeing the questions pop up here. And Christine, I know you told me to leave them to you, but I like this question so much, I'm going to ask him to ask it. Can you hit your mic and ask Mark the question? Q from KQ? Yeah, you.
You know what, Jack, it's good if you ask the question, so read them out to...
I'll read it out. Okay.
Yeah.
He asks, apropos Melbourne versus Sydney, do you reckon one of the Bronwyn-Bonnie type conditions was that place, i.e. Melbourne, that it was critical? For example, Nick couldn't have come out of Sydney. What do you reckon, Mark?
Yeah, of course. I think that's pretty true. Couldn't come out of Sydney? Gee, I don't know. That's a big...
I totally agree with him. Like, one of the things that shat me about growing up in Sydney was the deification of Radio Birdman. Whether they were good or not is one question, but they saddled Sydney with that Detroit sound for the 80s. I don't think Nick would have come out of that at all.
Well, yeah, and yet Crime in the City Solution did, and there were some early sort of parallels.
They could write.
But I get it, like Nick is, I think, a quintessential Victorian and ultimately Melbourne artist. I do think Wangaratta is as important to Nick as Melbourne, but obviously the Tiger Lounge and the Crystal Ballroom, the intellectual and artistic culture of Melbourne, the idea of sort of salons of people sitting around discussing art, however pretentious that might sound in retrospect, the kind of the bar sort of culture, just everything about Melbourne, I think, affects what Nick is. So I reckon he's right. And the book itself is very much about how landscape physically and landscape culturally formed Nick, for sure.
There's another question here from Rob. Could Mark comment on one song? We call upon the author to explain.
Well, I think that's, to my understanding of the song, intended on a number of levels. I mean, on one level, it's a sort of a sarcastic kind of address to God. But I think on a sort of more intimate level, there's a faint echo of it as an address to Nick's father as well. And if you read the book, you might kind of know why I say that.
Right. Someone else asked, does Mark like Nick as a person?
Oh, really? Actually, you know what? I do. I think Nick's a really good guy. I mean, I obviously met him long past his addictions. I mean, there's still plenty of spikiness in Nick. We I don't know if I'd say we quarrelled, but we certainly agreed to disagree when it came to the path I stayed on in regard to completing the biography. But Nick was always very friendly to me, very respectful. And when I was in trouble, like, Nick was, you know, pretty decent to me. And I can only really say good things about him. You know, I know in the past his behaviour, particularly as when he was a heroin addict, kind of was pretty variable. But I think all of us in our lives have a lot of ups and downs. And I mean, this is something that kind of interested me just generally about the idea of biography and dealing with all the people around Nick. You know, like these days we seem to only have two types of people, good people and bad people. But the reality is, in how we live our lives and how we act, that there's a lot of good and bad in all of us, and we're sort of struggling to be better. And in my encounters with Nick, he'd kind of, come out sort of a bit more on top of that struggle, and was a good guy, and he was a real pleasure to hang out with.
There's a question here that I know is just sort of open-ended. I'm going to make it a bit more specific. Stephen asks, what's next? After writing about Nick Cave, what do you want to write next? I might add to that, I can't help it, but I want volume 2.
Yeah. Oh God, man. This book almost killed me, you know. But, you know, I mean, I've learned a lot from it. I think in the process of writing the book, I would be a lot more organised next time, because I made a lot of just like sort of administration mistakes, because I didn't understand how big the task was and how long it would take. And you know how it is, like you play a big game, you learn how to play that game again. But it's not a thing I'm kind of rushing into. You know, I've got a kind of novel on the back burner, another book of poetry. I know thousands aren't going to be screaming for my novel or my poetry, but I'd like to do that, and also get a collected journalism out, which might be a more kind of public interest in relation to this. And then think about the possibility of a volume 2. I mean, I'm 60, so gee, can I live long enough to, you know, catch up with half of Nick's life? For sure, I've got the material. So volume 2, if and when I should do it, would be London, Berlin, and Sao Paulo. I've got all that stuff, so it's doable, but it's a challenge. You know, it scares me a bit.
Yeah, I'm sure you're about as interested in diving into that right now as roasting yourself on a barbecue. But
yeah.
Yeah, I have to say, it's been. I mean, I really love your writing, as you know, and I really love the topic of this book. So it was really nice to see a worthy biography about its subject, and particularly in the rock and roll biography genre, because boy, we've had a decade or so of stinkers in that department. They just keep rolling them off the treadmill, the clip jobs, and it's nice to see someone taking an artist seriously for a change, as a serious historical subject. You know.
Oh, yeah, well, thanks, Jack. I always felt I wanted this book to not just be treated like a rock and roll biography, but that it could sit on a bookshelf between biographies of like Brett Whiteley and Patrick White, or whatever, and Germaine Greer. And so it's a biography of a great Australian artist, and the rock and roll thing is a plus, you know. But for sure, I think in Australia, we generally treat our history, we especially treat our kind of rock and roll and popular culture history like garbage most of the time. And the interest is just in sort of churning stuff out, and yet there's so much possibility there, and the absence of recognition around our history is pretty shocking, really, and the quality of how it's treated maybe even worse. So, you know, it matters to me a lot that the book can rise to that level.
Okay, well, I'm sure it's going to do really well. Is it overseas? Is it going to be overseas this year?
Yeah, it's published here by HarperCollins in Australia and New Zealand, and it's going to appear in England and Europe, and I think the Commonwealth, but England and Europe anyway, in March through Atlantic Books. And so now I'm just trying to sort out the possibilities of a publisher for the USA, but basically it's sort of inching towards, you know, the global explosion, and yeah, see how I go.
All right, well, we've gone well over time, unfortunately, so I might leave it for Christina to bid everyone farewell.
I think that we all just want to join you, Mr. Jackson Marx, in saying thank you for asking those questions. Thank you for asking the questions that we all wanted the answers to. And to you, Mark, thank you. Thank you for joining us and speaking so eloquently about your subject and answering those questions that were not all easy, but needed to be asked, I thought, needed to be asked. To all of you that joined us this evening, thank you so much on behalf of HarperCollins and, of course, Readings, my place. Thank you so much for joining us. Such a treat to have you here with us. Go well, everybody. Keep listening to music, of course, and maybe, you know, just keep reading. That will help.
Thanks,
Good
Jack.
night, everybody.